Welcome back to Vlogs of History. I'm your host, Darius Cousin, and contrary to last week, this week we're going to take a look at something a little more positive. Last week we talked of genocide. This week we're going to talk of a huge boom in consumerism and partying in the United States. We're going to be focusing on one decade in particular, the 1920s, often referred to as the Roaring Twenties. So let's get to it. The 20s are often referred to as the Roaring Twenties because during that time, world society was roaring indeed. With World War I just behind them, people were ready for a life of peace and prosperity. Soldiers had come back from the war with salaries ready to be spent on consumer goods. Since the country was recovering from World War I, companies started producing tons and tons of goods to be sold to the consumers. The economy experienced a huge boom all throughout the 20s, and the nation's GDP followed accordingly. Mass production technology became available to the middle class finally. When you're able to mass produce a product, you're also able to spread it out all over the country very easily, and so as a result, people were buying the same products everywhere. Metropolitan cities such as New York and Chicago, well, they blossomed. For the first time in history, you had more people living in cities than living in farms. This has never been heard of before. That's why New York City and Chicago have a lot of skyscrapers, because in the 1920s, well, they started building a lot of them in both cities. People weren't afraid to spend, and producers and companies knew it. With the popularization of the radio, marketers began creating radio ads that were meant to get consumers to buy their products. During the golden age of radio, well, radio programming was as vast and as diverse as TV programming that we have today. And as we have TV commercials every other minute, well, they had radio commercials every other minute too. This was also the time of ready-to-wear clothes and home appliances such as the electric refrigerator. Although these things were very popular, it's safe to assume that in the 1920s, there was one consumer product that was the most popular, the automobile. Before the war, automobiles were considered a luxury and not many people had them. With the war behind them and technology making it much cheaper to produce a car, well, cars became cheap and more accessible to the public. In fact, Ford's Model T, one of the iconic automobiles, cost just $260 in 1924. Now keep in mind, those prices are in 1924 money, and they won't equal the same thing today. Today, that $260 would have been worth $3,600. A big difference, but still cheap for a car, don't you think? In Canada, for example, in 1918, there were about 300,000 registered cars. A decade later, in 1929, there were about 2 million. The rise of automobiles reached a point where there was one car for every 5 Americans on the road. With automobiles comes infrastructure. I mean, you do need roads to drive on. Several roads were being upgraded to highways and expressways began being built. Electricity technology also picked up, having stalled a little during the war. Canada was added to the electric grid, and a lot of industries switched from coal power to electric power. In America alone, during the 1920s, the electrical output almost quadrupled. Telephone lines were being strung across the country, and for the first time you had an indoor plumbing system and a sewer system available for the people. All these changes in society in such a short amount of time are bound to make people excited for the future. A lot of these changes, like I've mentioned, were happening in New York City and Chicago and other big cities alike. When you're living in big cities, you have to work to support yourself. And with big cities, a new era of work came about, the white-collar job. People began working in offices, in skyscrapers, doing office-related work. The finance and insurance industries doubled and tripled in size respectively. Typewriters, filing cabinets, and telephones brought women to the workforce in big numbers for the first time. The woman, the single independent woman, had money to spend. Not only were women having more money now to spend on consumer goods, they were also given the right of vote in 1920. Feeling empowered, the woman created this phenomenon of a flapper. Now a flapper is a young woman with bobbed hair, often wearing short skirts, who smoked, who drank, and often said unladylike things, often being more sexual than usual. Mass consumerism towards this idea meant that a lot of women would adopt this fashion style. Although the average woman in society often only took the fashion element of the flapper and left the other things behind. Women found a love for dancing and dance clubs in the 1920s. Clubs became increasingly popular, and so did jazz music. People wanted a new kind of entertainment, and they found it in dancing. Although keep in mind, this was the time of the Prohibition. Alcohol was illegal, and so most of the action was done in speakeasies run by bootleggers. In fact, I do actually have a whole video on the Prohibition. If you're interested, I'll leave a link right here. Make sure to check that out. It's very interesting. The evolution of technology also spread to the entertainment sector, and more specifically, Hollywood. Most movies from the early 20s were silent because the sound technology had only come later in the decade. Nonetheless, people wanted to go to the movies much more than before. Movie theaters became increasingly popular, and so did movie stars. This was actually the start of modern-day Hollywood that we know today and modern-day celebrities. With the invention and adoption of sound movies later in the decade, well, movies became that much more popular. That's not to say, however, that silent movies were not enjoyable. They were, but I think we would all prefer sound. Nobody wanted the decade to end. Economically and socially, everything was perfect. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and this decade, well, it wasn't an exception. What ended the Roaring Twenties was the Wall Street crash of 1929. While not going into too much detail, it's safe to say that it was a very big crash that halted everything the 20s had built. The economy went into a huge recession and people stopped spending. People stopped buying these consumer goods that were the reason why the 20s were such a big economic boom. In fact, this is actually what started the Great Depression that lasted well into the 30s. Although when you have such a big and prosperous decade, you kind of need like another one to balance things out a bit. Alright, that was it for this week's episode of Vlogs of History. I really do hope you've enjoyed it, and if you did, please leave a like, share it to a friend, and subscribe to be notified when the next episode comes out. Remember, these episodes come out every single Monday, and if you've missed the previous one, I'll leave a link right here. Make sure to check that out, it's very interesting. Also, I do have another show called Vlogs of History After Hours that comes out every single Wednesday, so make sure to check that out too. As always, I'm your host, Darius Cosden. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.